So we'll get started. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm Corby Skinner, Director of the Writer's Voice in Billings, Montana, and involved with the High Plains Book Awards. At 5 o'clock this evening, we announced the Book Award winners, and as you might imagine, there's no banquet or celebration or readings. But in hindsight, I don't know if you can have hindsight after 2 hours, but in hindsight, I thought, I guess I'm really glad that Joe Wilkins and Pam Houston won the awards rather than me having to interview somebody that would be a little disgruntled and maybe not so happy about talking about their books. So I actually am thrilled to have Joe and Pam here because it makes it easy for me to interview them and chat with them because I've read every single thing both of you have ever read. And I was thinking about, Pam, I was just finishing your book that I'd read a long time ago, and I realized I'd read this, but I was reading the final chapter about the creeks and place, and all of a sudden I thought, you know, I remember when your first book came out and you came to Billings and did a reading. And Joe, we went up to your part of the world, up to the N-Bar Ranch, to meet with the Flat Willow Society of Writers. And Pam's book had just come out, had all these rave reviews, but the Flat Willow Society gave you a lot of trouble, didn't they?
Did they?
Don't you remember them saying, like, you know, change that second person. It doesn't work.
That's right. They didn't like the second person. Now that you say that, I do remember. And do you remember, Corby, that I worked at the N-Bar like years before the book came out, just for a few months? So it was
That's what I couldn't remember why we were there, but you had worked there.
I worked there as a whitetail guide, as a matter of fact, for 2 seasons and knew Tom, right? Tom?
Yes.
You remember Tom? Tom the owner. And he was a writer, even though he was also a rancher. I mean, not that those two things are in any way mutually exclusive, but and he started that group of writers. But we went all over the place, you know. We went all over the place, you and I, for one book or another.
Yeah. But Joe, isn't that your country?
Yeah, that's near there. Yeah, I've heard stories of the N-Bar. I've never worked there, though. I'm a little jealous, Pam.
The rancher was also a Zen Buddhist, if I recall.
Yes, he was. And he had also changed the practices of the ranch when he inherited it, I want to say, or bought it, but I think inherited it. And he reduced the number of cattle, and they were, you know, free range and organic. And he also had this whitetail, you know, hunting operation. So he had really returned it. He'd done a lot of work returning it to its natural state, at least.
It was one of the first ranches in Montana that was using holistic ranch management. You know, where they're moving cattle and changing what they grow in different fields. So that was really ahead of itself.
Yeah.
So before we get in, we're going to have Pam read a little bit from her book, Deep Creek, and then we'll have Joe read. But I realize I should sort of acknowledge the other winners for the book award. So I'm just going to, if you allow me to read through these quickly. For the children's book, Ted Richland of Bozeman won for the book Howl, A New Look at the Big Bad Wolf. For medicine science, Carl Davis from Missoula won a book. His book was 600 Generations. The woman writer, Margaret Lucas from Omaha, Nebraska, has an incredible novel, River People. Poetry, Jory Mickelson, who is with us, I think there he is, who is originally from a small town in Montana. He now lives in Bellingham, Washington, and his book of poetry, Wilderness Kingdom, won. Congratulations, Jory. For nonfiction, this is interesting. We had our first book from the United Kingdom, Lakota American, A New History of Indigenous Power by Pekka Hamilainen. And he lives in Oxford. I mean, I love the fact that we're getting books from England entered in the High Plains Book Award. For the first book, Judith Sarah Gelt from Albuquerque, New Mexico, won. Her book is Restless Steps Towards Sanity, a memoir. Art and photography went to a Canadian couple, editors of a book on Victor Sikansky, the Gardner's University. He's a ceramic artist. That's Timothy Long and Julia Kruger. I tell you, if you have a photographic book, try to get it up to Canada. Those books are so beautiful. I don't know who's publishing them, but just some spectacular publishers in Canada. In short story, Catherine Kohler of Edmonton, Alberta won for a book called Winning Chances. Young adult, Sue Farrell Holler from Grand Prairie, Alberta. Her book is Cold White Sun. And the Indigenous writer is Jessie Thistle from Hamilton, Ontario. This was a book that somehow somebody didn't pick up to review, and I said, oh, I'll read it and get it a quick review. I am so happy I did. It is a spectacular book called From the Ashes, my story of being Métis, homeless, and finding my way. And the book was also picked up by One Book Canada, so the entire country is reading this book. So congratulations to all of the winners. Next year we'll join in person and actually have a book festival again. Pam, Deep Creek. Tell us, before you read, tell us, I know your publisher's been trying to make you write this book for about 15 years.
And it took 8. Yeah, it's true. I wrote Deep Creek under a little pressure. But my thinking was, you know, W.W. Norton was my publisher for a long, long time. They pretty much let me do whatever I wanted for about 30 years. It seemed that I could do this thing for them. Of course, that was the initial thought. Once I got into the book, it became my book. I learned so much from writing it. You know, Corby, I've been teaching memoir writing for a lot of years, and I'd never really written a memoir, not a book-length memoir. And I learned so many things about memoir writing in the course of writing Deep Creek. It kicked my butt. And so, you know, now I'm really glad that I was talked into it, if you want to put it that way. That's putting it a little strongly, but yeah, they had been trying to get me to write that book for a long time. And I finally did. And it turned out I had a lot to say about my 120 acres and how it basically healed me and grew me up and turned me into a responsible person.
The structure of the book is also interesting because it is not a traditional memoir in terms of from the beginning to the end. You really jump around, and some of the chapters are thematic in terms of weather, in terms of animals, in terms of friends. Did you plan that? Was that your decision?
You know, I knew, you know, for me, whenever I write a book, my first thought is, what shape is it? Like, what object in the world does it represent? My book contents may have shifted. Was a 12-sided Rubik's Cube, which actually exists. With Deep Creek, I knew it was a calendar. You know, I knew that somehow the book about the ranch had to take the shape of a calendar, because as anyone who lives on a big piece of property or even a small piece of property knows, especially in the mountains, you know, if you ignore the calendar, you do it at your own peril. And so you have to get your hay in the barn by a certain day. You have to get your wood on the porch by a certain day. the lambs are going to come on this day, the bluebirds are going to return this day. You know, everything about the ranch is a calendar or an almanac. So I tried really hard to make the book a calendar. I literally started chapter 1, January, chapter 2, February. And I spent a couple of years banging my head against the wall trying to do that. And the story I had to tell just wouldn't go. And so I had to let go of the calendar. But then it came back to me in like year 4 of writing as these ranch almanac pieces, which are short interstitial pieces in between the longer chapters. And they actually do follow the calendar.
So Joe, would you confirm a fact from Pam's book that all lambs are born on March 23rd?
Ours weren't, but that's a really nice ranch planning, if that's how it works.
I read that and I thought, really?
They were, you know, the truth is they aren't anymore, but they were for years. Like it seemed like, you know, the rams and the ewes were going at it all fall, and yet somehow the lambs always came that last week of March. It always. But not this year. This year they must have known about the pandemic or something because they came in April.
And are probably sorry about that.
Oh, I don't think so. It was quite a bit warmer in April.
So Pam, do you want to read a section from Deep Creek for us?
Well, I do. And I was thinking of reading about the sheep, as a matter of fact. And then one more little paragraph to sort of give the feel of the larger book, because this little sheep mini chapter ranch almanac piece is fairly specific. But it is about my Icelandics. I've raised Icelandic sheep for 15 years. They're wonderful animals. They're cold hardy, they're tough. And this little mini chapter is about a ram we had for several years whose name was Wooly Nelson. Wooly Nelson is the friendliest ram we have ever had at the ranch. He's never butted anyone, and he shows no inclination to harm his own offspring. And he still wags his tail whenever you pet him, just the way the babies do. He has sired 3 generations of healthy lambs, and the ewes can't seem to get enough of him. He is black and white with such strict demarcations between the colors, he looks like 3 different rams glued together. But his babies come out all colors, sometimes even orange or gold. Wooly's only problem is that he has a genetic defect that make his large circular horns grow in too tight a spiral, the tip pointing in toward his face rather than out. After 3 years of adult growth, his horns were threatening first to block his vision and then to forcefully close his eyes. I waited too long to call Doc Howard, because I'd read that a sheep's horns carry so much blood, many animals bleed to death in the dehorning process. I was worried Doc would tell me it wasn't worth the risk and I should put Wooly down. As the horns got closer and closer to his eyes, I kept hoping they would twist away from them at the last minute, and his horns had curled so strangely over the years, it seemed possible they would, until it didn't seem possible anymore, and I had a ram who was almost blind. Go ahead and bring him in, Pam, Doc said at 11 on the Tuesday morning I finally got the nerve to call. We'll cut those horns off and he'll probably be all right. I hung up and my new ranch sitters, Emma and Kyle, looked at me expectantly. Is Doc coming out? Emma asked. He said to bring Wooly in, I said, and we all thought about that for a minute. One more sign I am not a real rancher is that I don't own a livestock trailer. And Doc had just had his knee replaced, so I knew he wouldn't want to come out. The Forerunner, Kyle said, and because it had carried dogs, cats, a baby elk, and most recently Ingrid, the yearling lamb, when she came down with a bad case of bloat, there seemed no reason not to give it a try. Except that Ingrid weighed roughly 100 pounds less than Wooly, and we had been able to lift her into the hatchback. However gentle, Wooly was still a ram. If he made up his mind to take his horns to the back window of the forerunner, there wouldn't be any back window left. Kyle is strong and wiry, a snowboard instructor and a gymnast. He thought if I backed the forerunner up to the gravel pile near the cabin, he could pull, drag, and/or ride Wooly from the corral across the yard, up onto the gravel pile, and into the hatch. He would sit in the back with Wooly, well, basically on Wooly, to try to keep him calm, try to keep him from bashing his way out either the back or the side windows. I would drive to Doc's and Emma would sit in the front passenger seat holding tight a rope we would attach to the hatchback because we had recently discovered the locking mechanism in the back door had a short in it and wouldn't relatch unless we disconnected the battery at the same exact second the hatch hit the frame. Getting that timing right took an average of 200 tries. And with the nearest reliable mechanic 90 miles away, we had been avoiding opening the hatch for weeks. The dogs had no problem getting in and out the side doors, but it was more than we could ask of Kyle and Wooly. Nor could we ask them to be patient for a half hour while we fiddled with the battery in the door. It's 8 miles from the ranch to Doc's, and Kyle spent most of them riding Wooly the way I once upon a time rode mechanical bulls in bars, trying to keep his body between Wooly's horns and the ceiling, between Wooly's horns and the front seat, between Wooly's horns and any piece of automotive glass. Doc's assistant, Sam, greeted me at the office door. "You have a goat in the back of that car, Pam?" "That's Wooly Nelson," I said. "He's an Icelandic sheep." "And who's his sidekick?" she asked. "That's Kyle," I said. "New house sitter, steep learning curve." "Bring him around to the side, Pam," Doc said. So I backed around, and after checking with Kyle to see if he was ready, "More than," he said, Emma dropped the rope and we opened the hatch and Wooly and Kyle tumbled out. "Tie him to the propane tank," Doc said to Kyle, who was wrestling Wooly to the ground by his horns. I glanced at Doc. "He's just kidding," I said. "No, he's not," said Sam. "No, I'm not," Doc said. And so we tied all 200 pounds of Wooly to a half-full 120-gallon propane tank, and Doc gave him a sedative that made him fall to his knees. Sam brought a veterinary wire saw strung between 2 hemostats, and Doc went to work on Wooly's first horn, about 4 inches from where it met his skull plate. We could smell the horn as the metal burned into it. Doc barked out orders for Sam to fetch him various drugs I'd never heard of, but I understood from context that one was in case Wooly started to wake up, one was to restart his heart if they gave him too much of the first one, and the third was to make his blood clot if we couldn't stop the bleeding otherwise. We all leaned in and waited. Doc was about half an inch through a 4-inch horn when he motioned Kyle over. "You do this for a while," he said, and Kyle glanced once at me and then took the hemostats from Doc's hands. "You want to do it fast," Doc said. "If you go too slow, he's going to bleed to death." Emma caught my eye. The day the 2 of them arrived at the ranch, Rick Davey delivered 250 bales of hay, and we had stacked them. This was only week 2. Kyle got down on his knees and bore down with the saw. "A little faster if you can manage it," Doc said, more kindly this time. After a few minutes, my arms started tingling with sympathy fatigue, and Kyle started emitting tiny grunts. Finally, the horn fell into the dust, and Sam jumped in to press gauze against the raw end of what was left, and then held the gauze up, revealing only a small spot of blood. "Well done," Doc said. "Take a minute, and we'll do the other horn." The second horn bled even less than the first, and Wooly started waking up 30 seconds after Kyle finished. Doc's estimates on the timing and amount of sedation uncannily accurate as always. "If you get that ram home before he wakes up all the way," Doc said, "Kyle will have an easier ride than he did on the way here." So together we heaved Wooly, who looked now a little less like a ram and a little more like Princess Leia, into the hatchback, reattached the rope, and headed back to the ranch. And then I have one more just little 2 paragraphs to read. Should I read it now or save it for later?
Sure.
Okay, well, this is the very last Ranch Almanac mini chapter. It's just called Almanac. And it's more in the spirit of the rest of the book, I would say. It's as beautiful a thing as I have ever known, living inside the ranch's almanac. How the weather shapes and dictates our lives, not just during a blizzard, but in every season. How the Leonids always follow the Perseids, how the monsoon always follows fire season, how wood follows hay and lambs follow the draining of the pasture, how lupin follows paintbrush, which follows flax, which follows iris, which follows the arrival of the bluebirds, which follows the last day of below zero cold. There's the way the sun warms the house right after sunrise through the east-facing kitchen windows. There's the smell of 250 bales of fresh hay in the barn on a warm September afternoon, and the colors of the sky over Bristol Head at dusk. A good bed of coals in the wood stove, a pot of Hungarian mushroom soup on the range, the fuchsia blooms of the skyrocket on either side of the driveway, a coyote pausing 1 foot in the air, crossing my pasture feet deep in snow, the smell of lanolin rising off the sheep, 5 elk beds near the creek in the back acreage still holding warmth from the vacated elk, the tiny tracks of mice in the snow. Roni, impatient for carrots, staring me down through the kitchen window on a frigid January morning. Orion, so bright and close outside my bedroom window in February, it's as if he's waiting for an invitation. The barn, always the barn, and its roofline against the blue of the mountain. The Milky Way, appearing nightly and milky above me. Moon glow on Pinkley's cabin, on the barn roof, on the snow in the pasture on a midnight cross-country ski, the screech of a red tail, the hoot of a barn owl, the high singing of a coyote, the bugle of an elk, or some other wild thing calling. A silence so big I can hear my own silence inside it. These are only a few of the ways the ranch mothers me.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I guess this is a good transition now that I think about it, and I didn't think about it till I heard you read that last chapter. It took you a long time, Pam, to find home and find that ranch. And Joe, you grew up there. And I'm just wondering how that's sort of different. I mean, you were certainly very still tied to the land, but what is the difference from growing up in that rural environment? And yours was very rural, Joe.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when I'd been thinking about myself, reading Deep Creek, and Pam, the almanac, the last one there is one I get really excited when I always read with a pen, and I get excited sometimes and start underlining or putting stars in the margin, and that's when I started underlining and then realized I was underlining too much, and I just had to like put a line along the side. Yeah, you know, I think I think it comes down to a couple of things, and one is sort of who we are when we're young and how we fit the place we happen to be, and in many ways I think the place I was born to and grew up did fit me. I loved that landscape, and I loved many of the folks who surrounded me. I was so lucky to have a mother who was fierce and wise and always hardworking, grandparents who were the same. But I also was someone who didn't fit it in some ways. I was too bookish. I was just abysmal on a horse. I mean, like if you know, like if you want to know everything to do wrong when you get on a horse, just watch me. And I don't know where that comes from. It just happened because my grandfather was astonishing on a horse, you know. And so there are these ways we fit and we don't. And I do know that I needed to go out and I needed to sort of measure myself against a different world for a while. But in many ways, I feel like I've come back to the world I left. We live in a small town for Oregon. It's would be perhaps a little bit bigger town in Montana, but it's still a small town here. Our vacations are always outside. That's where we head. And so in a lot of ways, I feel like I'm bending back that direction, bending towards the direction you have, Pam. And I don't know if you have to do that, if you have to see what's different to find out what works. But I think I did. I had to go out and try to see what else there was before I could turn back.
Joe, I want to read a little section. We have the judges for each one of the categories are finalists from the previous year. Not always, but for the most part, they do. And last year's award winner was Sue Henderson, who wrote Flicker of Old Dreams, which is such a beautiful book. She grew up in New York, but she came and spent a summer in Winnett, Montana, and wrote this incredibly beautiful story. And I just think that's sort of interesting. Let me tell you what she said. This is just a magnificent work of art on every level. I read it twice. First, gripped by the story, which is both intimate and sweeping. Then I went right back to the beginning to read it slower and marvel over the rugged poetry. Every character is tangled up in relationships with each other that go back generations, all tied to the memories and to the history of the land. The result is a story that surprises with compassion, mercy, and sacrifice. So I loved hearing that from her. And in fact, I will tell you, all the judges loved your book, Joe, which is not always the case with, people are very funny about what they like and what they don't like. But you were now, you have the trifecta. You have run poetry, short story, and novel, and it puts the bar pretty high for the rest of the writers.
Well, I am so happy to be part of the community you and others have built around the High Plains Book Award, Corby. So thank you for calling attention to stories coming from this part of the world and for bringing people together around those stories. It's meant a lot to me. I appreciate it.
I do it because I get readers' copies before other people do. That's my whole reason for being friends with writers. I get to read it first.
Right.
So, Joe, would you read a section from Fall Back Down When I Die?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I'll read a short section from the beginning. I went back and forth, but I think I'm going to stick with one I often read, and I think for folks who haven't read the book, it's a good introduction. But I'm going to read from one of the main characters, Wendell Newman, who's a range hand out in the Bull Mountains, a little bit north of Billings, and he's just he's found out he's the only sort of closest relative to his cousin who's been imprisoned, and her young son, 7-year-old son, needs a place. And so he's been designated the caretaker, and he doesn't really know what to do with the child except take him to work with him. And it's August, so it's wheat harvest, and he's got long days. And I think one of the things that I always think about the character Wendell, and I didn't even know this going in, but by the time I finished the book, I realized it, is that, this seems like one thing that might be too much for Wendell. He's got a lot going on, and most of it is tough. He's struggling. But this boy, Rowdy, coming into his life, his cousin's son, sort of becomes, in a lot of ways, the thing that allows him to be his best self. Someone who cares, someone who takes care of others. And so we see, I think, a little bit of that beginning here in this early chapter. So he's taking Rowdy to work, and they're in the grain truck, and they're driving back and forth. Late in the evening, the sun bleeding through the pines, the broken land about going shadowed and blue. Wendell turned to find the boy sitting ramrod straight on the bench seat, like he'd been most of the day. Scrawny shoulders cockeyed, eyes wide as skipping rocks. Wendell figured Glenn would most likely work them until midnight to try to catch up, and remembering the tall bedtime tales his old man used to spin for him, he thought he might tell a story to help the boy relax, maybe even curl up and close his eyes. Let's say I tell a story. What would you say to that? The boy turned and blinked, waited. All right then, let me get a dip here first. Wendell reached for the can of Copenhagen he'd left on the dash, thumped it once and set it on his thigh. Left hand on the wheel, he carefully worked the lid off with his right and set it too on his thigh and pinched up a chew. Just as he got the tobacco situated in his lip, the boy reached over for the tin and the lid and clicked the two together and handed the can back to Wendell. Wendell smiled, winked at the boy. I don't care what anyone says, Rowdy Burns. You're a gentleman. Wendell told the boy about the long days of tilling and leveling and planting in the spring, the hope of rain hooked to the inside of you like a weight on your heart. And how when the rain comes, hope pulls the other way, lifting the heart like the rain does the green shoots, which poke up and lengthen, and before you know it, dry to gold and deeper gold. He told the boy about the tremendous red machine of the combine, the spinning forks that feed the wheat to the cutter bar, the triangle blades that snip the wheat, the thresher that does the sorting, sending chaff spinning out behind the combine onto the stubbled field and collecting hard red durum in a hopper. Until the combine makes for the edge of the field, the auger bar straightens out and the wheat spills into the empty bed of the grain truck. And here we are, Bud, driving these dirt roads back and forth, carrying the wheat to the silos, where we auger it up into the silos, and then it waits in the silos to be sold. Wendell glanced at the boy, who was listening hard, watching him like a pilgrim watches the sky for a sign. Before them, the road unspooled and narrowed off into the far reaches of the gathering night, starlight sliding down through road dust. In the silence, Rowdy blinked and shivered, leaned into the bench seat, relaxing his shoulders ever so slightly. Wendell went on. He told about what came next and easiest to him, which was high school basketball. How everyone in a 50-mile radius showed up for home games, with more than half that traveling to away games and tournaments. He told about how goddamn much he missed playing basketball, coming hard and sharp off Toby Karinko's pick, the squeak of his sneakers, the slick of sweat to shoulder, bump shoulder, and catching the pass from Daniel McCleary and squaring and rising, and the apex of his leap, levering the ball up and out and watching as he dropped back to the hardwood, the ball snapped through the net. How the crowd rose up then and hooted and hollered and stomped on the old wood and steel bleachers, and how the gym, a tight cinder block square with the out of bounds lines right against the walls, fairly shook with that unbridled sound. Basketball had set things right for him, he told the boy. With his father gone and most of their land sold or leased, he'd been the one without on the playground. He'd been the odd one out on the playground. Here in this far place, a frontier that was all men and territory, he was the one without, lacking both. And the rules concerning such things were hard and fixed, and applied with full and violent force to everyone. But Wendell couldn't find the words to explain this except to say again, the basketball had saved him. He closed his eyes for a moment, felt the gravel and the ruts and the old cracked tires and the wheezing metal frame, secret worries of the stars. He opened his eyes. After they won the district tournament his junior year, he told Rowdy Glenn and bought the whole team dinner at Jake's, the best steakhouse in Billings. Wendell had scored 26 points and grabbed 11 rebounds, and Glenn had come right up to him special and said he couldn't order anything but prime rib, the most expensive thing on the menu. That steak, Wendell told the boy, was as big as the plate. The sweet, bracing burn of tobacco was in his throat. The boy had curled himself into the passenger side door, eyelids drifting, falling shut. The two of them were close enough to touch, but they were not touching. They were alone in the old rattletrap grain truck, traveling through the dark, one small, true, utterly unseen thing in a universe of such things. Now Wendell told the sleeping shirt-tail relative of his something he'd never told anyone, that even though he didn't take much but basketball seriously in high school, he loved nothing more than when Mrs. Jorgensen, the English teacher, ancient, stern, an angry-looking mole on the side of her nose, would assign a new book, Tree Grows in Brooklyn, The Outsiders, Cannery Row. He would come home and say barely 2 words to his mother before disappearing into his room, and from there into the strange, particular worlds of those pages. Places and times for the worlds were sometimes the same and sometimes different, and the place he knew so well, Muscle County, with its residents numbering fewer than 5,000, was suddenly, frighteningly, one of many. It confused and thrilled him, that the world was mutable, variegated. He told the sleeping boy that even though you were supposed to turn the books back in after the quiz and the report, he started keeping them. Mrs. Jorgensen must have known, but she never told him to stay after school so she could ask him about it. And even if he didn't much have the time to read anymore, those books were still stacked on his bedstand. The moon came up, whistle thin, a tooth, a claw, the leanest blade. and a low wind skulked among the twisted knots of sage and greasewood and drifted down the hills, its breath cool and dry where it touched him on the inside of his arm, the hollow of his neck. Because he wanted to, because he realized in the telling there was so much to tell. He told Rowdy about the countless days he'd spent tromping through the woods, trapping and hunting in the bowls. He told about the sheer sides of canyons, the fading markings that Indians and homesteaders had carved into the sand rocks. He told about the elk herds growing year after year, surprising everyone, and the beetle-sick pines, whole ridges gone orange with chewed dead trees. He told about the time he and his old man were checking their trapline when they came on a lynx, the first and last he'd ever seen, just as it was about to gnaw through its own front left knee. His father, calm as could be, raised up his .22 and put a clean hole in the cat's head. They skinned it out that day and cured the hide, and even now, that banded done, three-legged lynx hide hung across the back of the easy chair in the trailer. The memory of his father quieted him. There was a sheaf of coyote pelts, one closet or another, and any number of fox and raccoon and rabbit skins tucked here and there. He'd get a couple out for the boy, he thought. Hang one in his room, maybe. Put one on the floor by his bed for when he got up in the night. He and Glenn had gone into town a couple of weeks ago and stopped for coffee at the drugstore, and all the talk was of the upcoming wolf hunt, the first fair chase wolf hunt in the history of the state of Montana. You ever run your hand across a wolf hide? One of the old timers, milky-eyed Creole Pool, had asked him before remembering who it was he was asking. Wendell thought again of his father, how in one motion full of grace he took the rifle from the butt and fire. Wendell came up a low hill, and the headlights of the truck slid from dark sky and star-scattered a cheatgrass and gravel road. He still had a few rifles. He still had his father's old traps. Over how busy Glenn had kept him, he hadn't buffed the rust from the teeth or boiled him and died for a long, long time. The boy shifted in his sleep and stretched his thin legs out until one of his soft feet just touched Wendell's leg.
Wonderful. I love that Wendell is telling all this story to a silent, scarred little boy who doesn't talk.
Yeah.
And you just, I guess it's what I think of as the power of sort of storytelling. I can't read Pam's book or your book without hearing your voices, you know? I mean, I've known Pam for a long time, but I hear that narrative voice, and I'd love the scene where Wendell, who probably doesn't talk very much, is just bleeding his heart out to this silent little child. It's so beautiful.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I think, I mean, I don't know that I realized that in the writing, but eventually started to realize that one of the things that's happening in this book is that people are trying to talk to one another, and they find these moments, and sometimes they're moments that, in a lot of ways, Wendell's talking to himself, right, trying to story his own self, and they when they have the opportunity, they want to say something, and they have stories to tell, and the sadness, I think, is that they haven't had as many opportunities as they need.
The short story book that you wrote, Far Enough, was probably the shortest short story book I remember. And everyone that read it loved it. And their comment was, yep. I mean, that summed up the whole, yep, like that's how it is. We don't need to talk anymore about it. And I wrote a review for the paper, and I wanted to be sure that my review wasn't longer than the words in your book. That was sort of
It was a very, yeah, it's a very short book of short stories. I don't even know exactly what you call it, whether it's short stories or a novella and short stories or what it is, but yeah.
So Pam and Joe, do you have questions for each other or comments?
Gosh. Well, I guess, yes, I have a question for Joe. I sort of asked him it the last time we did one of these things, but this ties back to your question, Corby, or at least your observation that, I went from the suburbs of New Jersey and found my way to the middle of nowhere in Colorado, you know, and I know you Montanans think there aren't any places in Colorado that are the middle of nowhere, but there are a few, and I'm in one of them. And, you know, have made my life there for 27 years. And, you know, Joe started there and then sort of went to the city, or at least more city-esque places. And now is kind of working his way back. And I myself am wondering, especially in the current political climate, like, do I want to go spend my old age among my bookish friends, you know, in Portland or wherever, you know? And so I'm wondering, Joe, like, how your romanticism about that place, and I know it's much more complicated than romanticism, but your heart attachment to that rugged and, you know, masculine and rough and tumble, don't have a lot of time for guys who write poetry place, sort of squares, you know, with who you've become in the world and your politics, or even if not your politics, just your values, you know, and how you make that all work out for yourself.
Yeah. I mean, the short answer is I don't know. Maybe a longer answer is that there, you know, there is, for me, a distinct pull to the landscape. Even here in Oregon, one of the places I'd love to go, we get over the Cascades and we get past Bend into the Crooked River country, which is this, you know, just this really deserty, wonderful, juniper covered, dry space. And I love it. Oh, it's one of my favorite places. We camp there all the time. And I feel myself pulled back to that landscape. That said too, though, there is, you know, there's the human landscape as well that we have to think about and contend with. And especially having two young kids, I think about it a lot. And I've lived, you know, I lived in a small town in Montana. I lived in a tiny little town in Mississippi for 2 years called Sunflower. Lived in a little tiny town in Iowa. So I've lived in a lot of small towns, and I do think that, as you know, as much as we have the interior and the coasts, we have so many things in common, but we do also have differences. And I think you're hitting on some of those. Some of those are political. Some of those are about values. And I would love it if we could still see one another and honor those values. And where our differences are, it's really hard right now to do that, I think, in our current political climate. And some of those too, it becomes hard because it becomes about some of those negate the ones, right? Some of these values are just can't sit by others. I think I would find it very hard to raise my kids where I was raised. I don't know that I would be able to negotiate that especially well. I say that, and I think it's true. I'm not positive, right? But I think it's true. I do think, though, one of the things I love about Deep Creek, Pam, is how you've dug in there. I mean, you've lived there, as you say, 27 years. I lived 19 years in the small town I grew up in. So you've got a decade, or, you know, almost a decade on me there. And the ways that you have forged these connections in the community, from Doc to the Blairs to all these other folks who are this wonderful constellation. Perhaps it's, you know, a lot of space in between the constellations just because of the out, you know, as you say, it's a long ways away from anything, but you have forged these connections. And I'd love to hear you talk about how that was for you across these 27 years.
You know, and also I think we have to be careful not to just romanticize the idea of the rural West. Joe, there's, in your book, there's some dark characters. Pam, there is weather, there is fire, there is hardship. I wish that Jory was actually with us, having grown up in rural Montana, and how difficult that was for him. So, you know, it comes with, I guess it's finding your place, not that there is a better place, one or the other.
Yeah. What?
I was just going to say, just thinking of Jory, our common friend, Pam, Taylor Brorby, had asked me, he said, did you know anyone who was out growing up in the West? And I said, it wouldn't, no, you couldn't have done it. You would have been.
You can hardly even speak about it.
No, you couldn't have done it. It would not have been possible, and to still be alive, period. And that's part of the struggle. How do we be with one another when that is potentially, on the table? It's scary.
Yeah. I mean, I would just say a couple things in response to all of that. First of all, I did make a conscious choice in Deep Creek to write about the people I liked, to write about the people who maybe they vote differently than I do, and maybe they have different, certain kinds of different values than I do. But I wrote only about good people. I could have written about, some of the haters, and the violent people in my town, which there are many of, but I chose not to. That's not what that book was for.
Yeah.
And to answer your question, Joe, I made those inroads with those people, one step at a time. I needed help. I'm from New Jersey. When I bought the ranch, I thought hot water came out of the wall, in an unending supply. And then I had 120 acres to take care of at 9,000 feet. So I needed help. And someone say, oh, so-and-so knows how to change a well, or so-and-so, can fix a fence in 2 hours. He could fix, so it was just one connection at a time. And of course, if you meet the kinder people, then you meet more kinder people because they hang together. And so of course, in any small town, I think probably even back east, who you can talk about politics or values with, and who it's better not to preserve the relationship, and I think we all learn that. All of that said, since in the last 3.5 years, I don't feel entirely safe where I am. And the mood has changed.
Yeah.
And, my husband, who is a white cisgendered man, does feel safe, but I don't, because I'm an uppity woman and I can't seem to keep my mouth shut. So it really has changed, like to my mind, there's liberals and progressives, there's conservatives, and then there's this other thing, which has changed the dynamics. I have many conservative friends. I have many friends with conservative values, but this seems like a different, more violent, time and a certain branch of that party which has gone a little rogue. And so I am literally afraid, and I'm threatened often. And so when I think about, do I want to move to Lopez Island to live out my life among the organic chicken farmers and the, drum circles, I think maybe it would be nice, now that I can't run as fast as I used to feel a little safer. So that's what I'm negotiating at the moment, much as I love the ranch and much as it has formed me. I mean, I say in the book, it's the single greatest love story of my life. And now I'm married to an awesome guy. So I may have to revise that. But when I wrote those words, I wasn't married to him. And it is, I mean, it taught me everything, and it made me who I am. I mean, absolutely, caring for that ranch made me a responsible, grown-up human. And so I will forever be grateful to it, even if even if, depending on how the next several months go, I feel I have to leave.
Yes, the next several months. certainly the political situation, which we won't get into now, but we certainly could, would cause some fear. And I think behavior of people right now is shocking to me. I wonder, Joe, in writing your book, you're crossing some lines with some of those people in Montana that are very specific about what's right or wrong or what is legal or not legal, and they don't always see the same borders that exist.
Mhm. Yeah, I was just to jump back to what you said, Pam. Since you said that the ranch raised you, turned you into who you are, and that's exactly how I feel about the place I grew up. It turned me into who I am, even though I haven't been there. I've lived longer away than I did there now in my life. But it is still that force, absolutely, that generative, that mothering, that fathering force in my life. I've been interested. So, I don't need to check my Goodreads reviews too often, 6 or 8 times a day. But it's been kind of interesting to see the jumping back and forth, because there's been a number of reviews that are, this is just liberal BS, it's indoctrination, da 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 da, and then you have these other ones that are saying, oh my God, this book is so romanticizing rural conservative America that it just can't be true. And I love that those two things are right next to each other somehow. I wanted to write a political book. I think that we don't think our landscapes and our stories are political at our peril, because they are, right? I mean, we are just, those things matter, and they matter in people's lives. And I wanted to write a book that was pushing on some of those things, that was alive to the ways our differences and especially our differences of values and politics bring a force to bear. And so I wanted that, right? And so I'm glad that even if we get these things on either side, glad folks are engaging with those.
It reminds me of Pam, early on when we were doing small towns across Montana, which you went to many of. I remember Miles City, and we would send writers from Billings to Miles City and had a really good turnout of people, but they didn't want to hear a book about the buffalo, and pretty much said, I don't want that writer in town. And then at the same time, several years later, Jim Galvin went to Miles City, and there was the conservative, city council people there, and then the liberal ranchers, and he spoke to both of them, and it worked. I mean, I've never seen, in fact, the host said, these people don't go to the same place or never in the same room, and they're all here to hear Jim Galvin. And that was The Meadow.
Well, Corby, The Meadow was the book that I had on my desk the whole time I was writing Deep Creek. I mean, I realized that's a novel and Deep Creek is a memoir, but really so many decisions I made in Deep Creek, including, to only talk about my good neighbors, that grew out of The Meadow's influence on me. That was a hugely influential book on me. And even though I read it a long time before I started Deep Creek, when I started writing Deep Creek, I was like, The Meadow, like it was kind of my, talisman when I was writing it.
That's so interesting. That's great to hear. The Meadow was not in this book, but in my memoir was also the one that, well, there was a couple, but that was one of those that mattered more than others. I've only met Jim Galvin once. It was at a bar in Iowa City, and it was after a reading, and I had read, and he came up to me afterward, and I recognized who he was, and I was sort of quaking in I think I was wearing shoes, not boots. I wish I could say boots, but and he was like, man, that Western shit, that's the real shit. So I took that as a very high compliment.
Jim Galvin won a Reader's Digest award, and there were and I was on a project with him. And so we went to Chicago, and incredible writers were there. There was a fancy dinner, and everybody was going to get $60,000. And we went, and the hotel wouldn't let Jim Galvin in the door because he had on Levi's. And I said, he's the guy winning, you know, he's the guy that's getting this, the reason we're having this dinner. And so the word got out, and then all of a sudden, all the other writers from Heather McCune to Don DeLulu said, fuck this, we're not going there either. And they were all gathered outside at a bar, all these writers. And what was interesting is the head of Reader's Digest came down and said, Corby, can you fix this? So Jim Galvin wore my pants, which is so funny, up to this thing. And that was the last year they ever did those Writers Awards again.
You broke it.
He took the money and ran, and it was just so interesting. But he was an incredible poet, really, and a writer too. So, well, I think we have had a lot of very patient people listening to us go on and on, but it's been great. I want to thank you both, and know that you're going to be my judge in creative nonfiction and fiction for next year. So,
All right.
thank you. Thanks to the Billings Public Library and this House of Books for helping put this on. We also got some support from the Billings Community Foundation and the CM Bear Family Trust. So I will tell the people that are listening in, we are getting copies of all of the books, of the finalist books, that will have book bags at the library. So you can read, you know, a lot of times someone will win and we'll have 2 books. And you think like, wait a minute, what if everybody wants to read this book and talk about it? So we will have that in another couple of weeks. So the public can read a little bit more about Rory and Wendell and so what dog is on the cover, Pam?
That's William.
And
William.
the dog that was in Montana was Fenton, wasn't it?
Yes. And yes, I mean, you know, I think probably more than one dog has been in Montana, but probably Fenton stayed at your house because Fenton lived a long time, you know, and he was such a good traveler. Yeah.
You remember when we were doing Sighthound and you had your dog with you, and we went to every little town and more dogs came than people. I mean, it was just sort of
That in
and they all knew.
In Gardner, there were like 22 people and 29 dogs or something.
And they all just were so patient. They knew the reading was for them.
Yeah. Yeah. And remember when we read at the animal shelter or the zoo? The zoo.
The zoo.
The zoo.
Mhm. Yeah. So, well, when things get better, and I hope they do soon, we will have you both back in Billings, and you can meet your fans and readers.
Can I just ask
Thank
you
you.
one quick question? Can you tell me the area boundaries or how it's defined?
I would love to tell you that. It's over 2 million square miles. So it is 7 states, the High Plains, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, not Utah, Colorado and Kansas, but then the 3 and Nebraska and the 3 Canadian provinces. So it's 3 times the size of Texas, the High Plains.
I like it.
All right.
And you guys are the best ones from the High Plains for this year. So, hey, congratulations.
That's great. 2 million square miles. Is that what you said?
2 million square miles.
Wow.
That I feel large. I feel enlarged.
Containing multitudes right now.
Yeah.
Thank you much.
All right. Bye-bye.